In the previous video, we talked about the for statement, which was a way to come up with a for loop to be able to process a statement or set of statements a given number of times. And in this video, we're going to look at the while and also the do while statements. The thing is, with looping, sometimes you might want to loop instead of a specific number of times, you might want to loop until a certain expression evaluates to false. For example, you may not know how many times you want to loop ahead of time. So what you need to do in those scenarios where you don't know how many times you want to loop, but you want to continue looping until that expression is true or until something happens, in other words, is you want to use the while statement. So let's go through the syntax of a while statement. So in this example, I'm going to create a simple variable called count, set that equal to 0. I'm going to type while, and in brackets count, not equal to 5. And then I'm going to type to print out what it is, the count value count, and I'm going to do count plus plus, and there we have it. So if we run this code, so you can see it's counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and just to be clear, we can change the count to 1 if we want, so we're starting on 1 instead of 0. Run that again. So this is similar to the for statement that we've used previously. To do something equivalent, it's the for statement, of course, we would have done something along the lines of for int I equals 1, I less than 7, I plus plus, and then we would have done, so that would be equivalent statement in the for loop, with the for loop. So you can see in the case of the while, there's no variable that's set up within the while loop like there is within the for loop. So we need to create our loop if we're going to do a counting mechanism before we start the while statement. Then we also need to increment our variable manually if that's the way we want to do it within the loop itself. So that's the difference between the two. But with that said, I'll just delete the for loop now. We don't need that anymore. We can also write this in slightly different fashion as well. Instead of the above example of the while, we could have written it like while true if count equals 5, break. And otherwise, we're going to print the message and increment the count. Like so. And just to make sure that this works, I'm going to set count back to 1 here. Because of course, after executing this loop, count will be set to 6. So if we run this example, and to be precise, I should have changed that to a 6, the same comparison as the other test. So I've written it in a slightly different fashion. With the previous example, we're checking to see whether it's not equal to 6. In this case, what we're doing is we're specifically saying if we get to the number, like in other words, we get to the stage where we want to break out of the code, in this case where the expression count equals 6, then we issue a break, which breaks out of the loop. But in both scenarios, you need to make sure that you do actually have the variable incremented. Because if you don't, what will happen is something along these lines. I'm going to comment that out just to show you what will happen. If we're not incrementing the count, we'll get into an endless loop. And then you can see what's happening there on the right hand side. IntelliJ is having a bit of a fit. The reason that it's coming up with that is we're getting to this loop here. While count is not equal to 6, it's printing out the count. Then we haven't reset the count. We haven't incremented the count. So it goes back and does another test to start doing the test again. So it's continually printing, checking whether the value is 6. So we're not incrementing the count. So make sure if you're using a while like this, the while statement, you are incrementing the count. So you'll see a code like this fairly often in Java code, while true. And what that actually means is it's going to be an infinite loop. So the loop will continue going, processing forever. But the way to get out of the loop is you do a test, some sort of test to check whether a given expression is true. In this case, we're waiting to count equals 6, and then we break out of the loop, much like you've seen before when we've used break elsewhere. So that's an alternative way to do things. Now, there is another gotcha in this scenario. So what can actually happen here is that the code may not get executed at all. So to show you an example of that, we'll just comment this code out for now. So if we change count to 6 and then run this, the code never gets into the while loop at all. And that's because this initial expression was evaluated to false, so it never actually got into the code block to execute any of the code in there. So that's an important thing to remember with a while loop, and likewise with a for loop. we did something like this, we'll run that, we won't get any output either. And that's because the initial value was set to 6, and we're doing a comparison test there to say I is not equal to 6. So of course the first time it does this evaluation, that's false because I in fact is equal to 6. So the code doesn't get executed within the code block itself, and likewise for the while statement as well. So that can be a gotcha sometimes. If you're wondering why your code isn't being executed, make sure you check the first expression and make sure going in for the very first time that expression doesn't evaluate to false, which means it won't execute any of the code. Now there's also a third type of looping statement called the do while, and it's got the other advantage that it will always execute at least once, and if not more times, depending on the way you've defined your test expression. So what we'll do is we'll do an equivalent thing. We'll type do, which is the keyword we're using for the do while statement. Then we can type count value was plus count. Then we'll do count plus plus. Then our expression to test to see whether we should exit the do while or not is at the end. We type while after the closing brace, then we put our expression, which would be exactly the same expression, would be something like count not equal to 6. Then we put a semicolon to close it off. So if we change our count here to 1 again, and just to be sure, we'll comment these other ones out. And we'll run the code. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can see that it's operated very, very similar to the while that we've done on there. The only real difference was we had the word do at the top, then the while component appeared at the bottom of the statement there. But the other thing it'll do is if we set that to 6 initially and run it, you'll get a very weird error, as you can see there. So what's happening is the do while is guaranteed to execute at least once. So in this scenario, what's happened is we had the initial printout. So count would have been, the count value was 6. Then we then incremented count, so it went to 7. But then the while expression at the end, count not equal to 6, that is going to be true from now on. And the reason was count was equal to 7 there. So therefore we got into virtually an infinite loop where it continually went through incrementing the number and running the loop. As you can see there, 990,000 times until I stopped it. So that's another thing to keep in mind with the do while. It's always going to be executed at least once. So of course, if we set that back to 1, that'll work quite nicely, and that'll show 1 to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you can see, because we initialized and set it once. And the do while can also use a break statement. For argument's sake, we could set it up so that we could put if count greater than 100 break. So that's going to break out of the loop again. So we could test that, and you should find that it'll display up until the number 100, and then it will execute, because that will execute that command there, the break. So if we run that, you can see it's executed to the value of 100. But let's look at a better example than what I've come up with so far. So I'm going to comment this code out. I'm actually going to comment the code out at the top as well. Just comment out that variable. So it's challenge time. Okay, so the challenge is to create a method called isEvenNumber, and it takes a parameter of type int. So the purpose of the method is to determine whether or not the argument that's been passed to the method, the int in other words, is an even number or not. If it is an even number, return true. Otherwise, return false. I'll give you a bit of a hint here to look at using the remainder operator. All right, go ahead and try that out and see if you can figure it out. Pause the video now and come back once you've tried it out and to check what I've come up with. Okay, how did you get on? Let's go ahead and write that method. So we start up with a public static boolean, because we want to return true or false, is even number. And we're going to take a parameter of int, and we'll just call it number. So it's going to be our number that we're going to use to determine whether it's true or false. So a simple way to determine whether a number is even or odd is just to use the remainder operator like so. So we just do if number, or if the remainder of number and 2, using the remainder operator, I need 2 brackets here actually. So if the answer to that equals 0, in other words, there are no remainders, what that means is that is actually that is an even number. Otherwise, if we do get a remainder, we know that it's an odd number. So that's the way to determine whether a number is even or not. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to create some code that is going to execute that method. So my code is going to start off with an int number equals 5. That's the number we're going to start on. And the number we're going to finish on, we're going to call finish number, set that to 20. Our while statement is going to be while number less than or equal to finish number. Then we're going to type if not is even number. We're going to increment our count, our number. Then we're going to type continue, which is another keyword we haven't talked about yet. We'll come back to that. Down here, we're going to type even number plus number. We're also going to increment the number there. So what is this code doing? Well, if it's going to start at the number 5 and go through and finish up to and including the number 20, then we're testing to see whether that number is an even number. If it's not an even number, we're going to increment the number so we start work on the next number. Then we're going to do a continue, which is different to break. Both of them have the effect of interrupting the code, but in the case of continue, what happens is it'll bypass this code, finish the loop and go back on and start on the next number again. So in this case, the continue will effectively go back up to the while, to the top again, and start processing, this time with the new number, because of course we specified number plus plus there. So just to confirm that, what we should get now is all the even numbers between the ranges of 5 to 20 printing on the screen. So let's try that. And you can see we've successfully managed to get that to work. 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20. So that's what the continue keyword is. It basically says stop where you are, continue on to the next sort of test, if you will. And eventually down here, so in this case it was an even number, so we printed it out, we incremented the number, and went back up to the start again. And remember, the do while is effectively identical to the while. The only difference is we're just testing at the bottom. While is probably the statement you'll use more than a do while, but they all have got their place. And as you'll see throughout the course, we'll be using these in more detail. You'll sort of you'll start getting an understanding of where to use it, which one and which order, etc. Okay, so it's challenge time. Okay, so the challenge is to modify the while code above. So leave the existing functionality as it is, but make it also record the total number of even numbers that it has found. And once 5 even numbers have been found, to break out of the code and display that total number outside of the while statement. So pause the video and go away and give that a try. Once you're ready, come back and you can check out the solution I've come up with. Okay, how did you get on? Did you figure it out? Well, I've got one solution here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this code. And then I'm just going to comment it out. I'm going to paste this code here. And what we need to do firstly, we need to record the total number of even numbers it has found. So we need some sort of count variable. So we're going to call it int even numbers found equals 0. So next we need to record that. We've created the variable. So the obvious place to record that would be this line here, because this line is only executed if there is an even number. In other words, if the not is even number isn't processed. If that makes sense. It sounds a little bit confusing, but essentially that's the code that's executed when it isn't an even number. So therefore the place to put the code to add to the total number of even numbers we found would be outside of that code. So there I'm going to put even numbers plus plus. And then the last bit is at the end, display the total number of even numbers found. The way to do that would be to type even numbers found. So if we run that code, so that's printing it out. So why didn't it exit after 5 were found? Well, that's because we haven't actually implemented that break yet, have we? So what you need to do is put an additional test in here after the even numbers found to put if even numbers found greater than or equal to 5, break. Like so. So now if we run that code, we've got total even numbers found equals 5. Of course, the 5 numbers were 6, 8, 10, 12. However, we didn't get the last printout for number 14. And the reason is, if you look at the code, we've got our test happening after that. So what we could have done to make that clearer is we could have changed the order, moved this down a little bit here, and pasted the code there so that it's printing out the even number first, incrementing the number count, and then it actually does the test here to see. So now if we run that code, we find we've got 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, total even numbers found equals 5. Okay, so that's the while and the do while. You've now got a good understanding of the various looping statements that exist within Java, and it's time to move on to the next video.